Hey class, Chapter 8 has to do with group influences, and there's a lot of topics in this chapter that are a little similar to each other, so I wanted to make a lecture video to try to help point out how some of these similar topics are unique and different from each other. So throughout this chapter, it really addresses four major group influences, which I have there on the PowerPoint. Social facilitation, and the emphasis on that is that being in groups can create arousal, like physiological arousal, emotional arousal, and that can affect our performance on tasks. So the focus of social facilitation is mostly has to do with task performance. De-individuation is the effect that groups have on our sense of self-awareness, and sometimes we kind of behave according to group norms, and we kind of lose sight of our own personal values and personal expectations, and sometimes that can influence our behavior. Can behave in ways that are contrary to the kind of person we typically are. And group polarization has to do with the strengthening of your attitudes and beliefs in the context of a group setting, particularly when you're with people who share your beliefs or attitudes. Your beliefs and attitudes tend to become stronger in the presence of those groups. And the last one is groupthink, which focuses mostly on decision making within a group. And so I'm going to kind of go through each one of them quickly. I'm not covering everything you need to know on the test about these topics, but I will at least cover the major points. So we start with social facilitation, and the definition there is the strengthening of the dominant responses, whether they're correct or incorrect, in the presence of others. And what that means is that sometimes just being around other people can affect your performance, but it really depends on what your dominant response is. So, for example, if you're given easy math problems to solve on the board in front of your classmates, and you're really good at adding, let's say you're a college student and your teacher asks you to go up and complete those simple addition questions, your dominant response will be strengthened because it's an easy task and you'll perform quite well on that. And but if you're given a more difficult problem to solve, like the one on the screen, number 13, the point is, even if you know how to solve that, because it's more challenging, it may take you longer to solve that task in front of other people than it would if you were sitting at your desk doing it privately. And that's kind of how this works. So when we're performing easy tasks, being watched by others tends to improve performance. When we're performing difficult tasks, being watched by others tends to hurt our performance. A lot of people think this has a lot to do with home field advantage, that in most sports, statistically speaking, home teams or teams perform better on their home field or their home court than they do when they're on the road playing somewhere else. And part of the reason might be for that is regardless of where you're playing, you know people are watching you, but there's something about performing a task in front of people who you know are rooting for you and supporting of you that it can actually improve your performance, and that may be why teams have a higher winning percentage on their home court. So you can see this oftentimes when people are even at sporting events, perhaps. They might cheer a lot louder and seem a lot happier when their team scores if they're around a bunch of people who are cheering as well. If they're at home by themselves watching in their chair, they'll probably be happy when their team scores, but probably not going to be jumping up and down like they might be doing around other people. This is also something that you see with shows that are not recorded in front of a live studio audience. Typically, many comedy shows will add a laugh track to the recording, because even though there aren't other people in the room watching you laughing, perhaps, but you can hear people laughing on the laugh track, which tends to facilitate your own laughing. I have a quick clip I'll show you here of the Big Bang Theory where the laugh track has been removed. And of course, it doesn't seem nearly as funny or entertaining when that laugh track is missing.
You could solve all your problems. Hey, you know, it occurs to me you could solve all your problems by obtaining more money.
Yes, it occurs to me too.
Hang on a moment.
Oh,
Here, take some. Pay me back when you can.
wow, you got a lot of money in there.
That's why it's guarded by snakes.
And as you can see from that clip, that show doesn't seem nearly as humorous when there aren't other people laughing. So the book talks about why we are aroused in the presence of others, and there are 3 points brought up about that. One is evaluation apprehension, which just means that we get apprehensive or anxious when we feel like we're being evaluated by others. The other is driven by distraction, which just means that being around other people can distract you or can cause you to lose your focus on what you're doing. And that can cause us to perform more poorly. And sometimes what we just call the mere presence of others can be arousing. And I find that to be true as a runner. For whatever reason, I feel like I always give my best effort when I'm training for a race, or actually when I'm racing. But when I'm racing, my running times are always quite a bit better than they are when I was training. And there's something about being around other people, even though I don't feel people are evaluating me, because people I'm racing with don't really know me, and I don't really care what they think about me. But there's something about being watched by other people that does tend to improve most runners' performance on race day. So I'm going to show you a little example of a sportscaster who kind of struggles a little bit, and see if we can apply one of these to his situation.
We'll take a look and see how that happened. They started off good, but then eventually the Ball State women's team shot down and ended up doing poorly. Oh no. And okay, we're going to continue on now. The Ladies Cardinals will play an Iowa tournament starting this Friday. Before the Ball State baseball team kicks off its conference season this weekend, the Cards will battle an in-state rival Indiana tomorrow. Tomorrow's game will be the meeting between the two, beating both.
First.
Hoosiers are on 4 on the year, and they have won 6 of its last 7 games. Tomorrow will be the game 3 at 3 p.m. Switching to Ball State men's tennis, it seems every week they have a player.
Well, as you can see, that young man really struggled to get through that sportscast, and perhaps he was driven by distraction when maybe one of the clips he was expecting to show up on the screen while he was talking the right clip didn't appear or something, and that became a distraction to him. Or perhaps a combination of that and feeling like he was going to be evaluated by his boss or his coworkers who were unseen. Whatever the case, though, he certainly struggled with that. And of course, with more experience, we've all probably felt this before, even on our jobs and stuff. As you get more comfortable with your roles and how to do your jobs, and you have less problems with that kind of thing. This young guy here is a college sportscaster on probably a campus TV station at Ball State University, and probably doesn't have a lot of experience yet. But he will get better, I'm sure, with practice. So along this idea of social facilitation is the idea that social loafing, and that is sometimes when people are working in groups, they put less effort towards the goal when they're in groups than they would if they were by themselves. And I think this is probably one of the the major reasons that a lot of students don't like group work, because students who take their work seriously kind of anticipate that there are going to be some slackers in the group. And this has been demonstrated over and over in research. That people, for example, in Ringelmann's rope pulling experiment, when people thought other people were behind them, helping them pull the rope, they put less effort into it. And the more people that they believed were helping them pull the rope, the less their personal effort became. And one way to prevent that is to make sure that everyone in the group is being evaluated individually. And some instructors will do that in group work. They might even have their own members of the group. The students themselves will evaluate each other based on the amount of work they did. But when we don't feel like we're being evaluated, and there's no evaluation apprehension, that oftentimes does lead to less effort on our part, which can lead to social loafing. The second major topic in this chapter is de-individuation, which is really just that sometimes we lose our sense of self and our self-awareness when we're in the presence of other people. And sometimes we do things that we normally wouldn't do, maybe through peer pressure or whatever. But I think peer pressure has a lot to do with conformity and is a form of conformity. But de-individuation, I think, sometimes is just like we just kind of start taking on the role of other people in the group, and our behavior matches the group behavior. And it's widely believed that a lot of people who get involved in riots, they're not bad people, but when groups start getting rowdy and emotions run high, everyone's physiological arousal increases, and then that can lead to people experiencing higher emotions and changes in their behavior, that they end up doing things that they wouldn't have done on their own. And you do hear a lot of people get in trouble for destroying property during riots, after the fact, saying it's not really who they are. You hear that a lot when people get in trouble with the law, and they'll say, like, this is not the person I am. And usually that's in the context of some kind of a large group gathering where people, people though will claim that they kind of weren't behaving the way they normally do, and have a hard time explaining that. They've kind of lost track of their personal sense of self-awareness. Some people believe that is why Philip Zimbardo had the guards wear silver reflective sunglasses, because he felt like it's kind of like wearing a mask. And when you have a mask on and people can't identify you, you feel anonymous or de-individuated perhaps, and you're more likely to treat people differently than you would if you didn't have that mask on, so to speak. This is also really common, I think, with people in online interactions. There's a lot of bullying and negativity that people will engage in online, oftentimes when their true identity is being withheld from others by the use of a screen name or something. And people will say things and do things online that they normally wouldn't do to another person's face. But that sense of anonymity and de-individuation can sometimes have that effect on people. So some of the factors that influence de-individuation are group size. Certainly large groups create greater arousal in people, which can affect people emotionally and contribute to different behaviors. Anonymity, as I just mentioned, certainly when we feel like we're anonymous, we're more likely to do things that we wouldn't do otherwise. The screen, you can see, is an interesting study about children who took more candy than they were supposed to on Halloween. And when they took the most candy and broke the rules the most by taking more than they were supposed to was when they had a mask on in combination of being in a group of other children. So there was kind of a double layer of anonymity there. And a lot of those children transgressed and took more candy than they were supposed to. So any kind of arousing or distracting activity can cause de-individuation. And of course, I think this is pretty common with riots and things of that nature. Oftentimes we kind of justify our behaviors too, rationalize them as being, hey, I'm just doing what the group's doing, or everyone else is doing this. It's not that big a deal, kind of thing. So increasing self-awareness can have a big impact on that, though. If people are reminded of their personal values and their sense of self-awareness, they're less likely to be influenced by groups. That might be one of the reasons that people who take a pledge of virginity until marriage may be asked to wear a purity ring, and that ring then can be a reminder to them frequently as they feel that ring and see the ring on their hand. It's a constant kind of reminder to them of the pledge that they took, and they're less likely to stray away from that pledge. Also, one of the reasons I suppose stores like putting mirrors, sometimes they have those bubble mirrors at the end of aisles and stuff like that. And one of the reasons for that is just that you can see yourself, and it's kind of a reminder to yourself when you're in the store who you are and what you stand for, and supposedly less likely to steal something from a store if you see your own face on the mirror and kind of remind yourself that you're an individual. The third major factor or group influence is group polarization, and this has to do primarily with attitudes and beliefs. And the idea here is that when you're with a group of people who share your attitudes and beliefs, they tend to become stronger. But it just depends what that belief is. So, for example, if somebody is a racist person and they're hanging around talking about race issues with other racist people, then they're likely to become even stronger in their negative attitudes towards minorities. On the other hand, if you're not racist or not prejudiced towards other groups, and you're discussing issues like that with other people who share your attitudes, then you're likely to become even less of a racist. So it just kind of strengthens your pre-existing attitudes in that way. And we can see this oftentimes where groups tend to be, through the process of discussing things, they tend to sometimes make riskier decisions or take riskier positions on things, probably because their likelihood of taking risks becomes greater when they're around other risk takers. But by the same token, people who are not risk takers will probably become less risky if they're hanging around people who are also not risk takers. So groups can intensify opinions. We see this all the time in schools. With cliques in schools, attitudes get formed, and when people join those cliques or groups, their attitudes towards other groups can become even stronger. And when Facebook first came out, it was kind of theorized that it would promote a great deal of diversity and understanding of differences, and it was going to help, kind of diversify the way people think about others and lead to more harmony and less discrimination and all that stuff. But the problem with Facebook is that it didn't turn out that way, because what happens is that we tend to seek out people who think like us. And when you click on things and like things on Facebook, there's an algorithm that kind of records the things that you watch and the things that you like, and it feeds more of that information to you. And so what happens is oftentimes group polarization becomes even stronger in the context of social networking, because people tend to seek out those who are like them, and sometimes they have even less exposure to other perspectives, and group polarization can really flourish sometimes. So why does that happen? Why do these attitudes and beliefs become stronger in the context of other people who are similar to you? Well, one is informational influence, which we've saw in a previous chapter, on the chapter on persuasion. And sometimes groups provide information to you that can convince you of your beliefs, that maybe your beliefs are right, and that can even strengthen your beliefs even more. And sometimes it's just normative influence, that sometimes we just want to be more like other people, or we don't want to stand out, and so we adjust our attitudes or beliefs to match those groups. The last of the four major factors related to group influence is groupthink, which has to do mostly with decision making. And this happens a lot in groups where there's a strong sense of cohesiveness. Oftentimes when we're in groups, we like to maintain harmony in the group. So oftentimes people don't disagree with group leaders. We just kind of go with the flow. And even sometimes though we privately disagree with the decisions that's being proposed in a group, a lot of people will agree to it anyway, just for the sake of maintaining the group harmony and not rocking the boat, so to speak. This is a classic example with the space shuttle disaster back in 1986, I believe it was, when it was recommended by one group of engineers not to launch the space shuttle because the temperatures were pretty cold, and their fear was that the rubber seals, which seal the fuel lines, would have shrunken in the cold weather, and they might not seal the fuel lines adequately. But NASA's engineers were feeling a lot of pressure to launch the space shuttle because the launch had been scrubbed several times due to other issues. And they voted unanimously to launch, and unfortunately the space shuttle blew up and took the lives of 7 astronauts. But interestingly, afterwards, when investigation was launched into that, several of the people that voted unanimously in that group to launch expressed privately that they had some real reservations about it, but they felt that they didn't want to ruin the harmony of the group, and this felt like they probably were the only ones that felt that way, so they didn't speak up. Unfortunately, several people were experiencing the same thing, and if one of them would have spoke up, the others probably would have joined in, and that launch probably would have never happened. So symptoms of groupthink. Sometimes when groups become confident and maybe increase in size or power or publicity, sometimes they begin to think that they're unstoppable or invincible, and they believe in the group's purpose and cause, and they don't question any of that. So they kind of march forward with this sense of entitlement and such. Can be a lot of people becoming closed-minded to other perspectives. They start rationalizing that their group knows best. I think we see this a lot with conflicts among countries and conflicts among groups, that each group thinks that they're right and the other group's wrong. They have a hard time seeing things from the other group's perspective. And sometimes they even stereotype the other groups as being idiots and things of that nature. Other symptoms for groupthink is that these are tight-knit groups usually, so there tends to be a strong pressure for people to conform to the group standards, or maybe even to conform to the group leaders' ideas. Oftentimes when people do speak out, they are shamed or punished, so people will censor themselves. That's what self-censorship means. People will keep their mouths shut even if they do disagree, for fear of being ostracized or kicked out of the group. There is an illusion of unanimity because people are afraid to speak out. You get the impression that everyone's agreeing, when in fact privately many people in that group might be disagreeing, but nobody's speaking out. So there's an illusion that decisions are unanimous, when in fact there really aren't, if you were to ask people privately. And oftentimes in high functioning groups, they are often people called mind guards, which are like public relations specialists whose job is to filter information to the group leader, generally only information that the group leader wants to know. So things become very one-sided in that way. And we see that a lot with the Church of Scientology and other cults, where group leaders are provided information that only confirms what they believe to be the case. And lastly, sometimes minorities do win out and go against the group. And what we've learned from a variety of studies and in case studies over the years is that minorities are most effective when they're consistent, and they don't waver in their disagreement with the group. So they're consistent and persistent in their disagreement. Oftentimes it takes a while, but if somebody is a minority in that way, other people in the group who may feel the same way will come around and start to join in and take their side on things. So it just takes a while sometimes, but that's oftentimes the case with the minority opinion. Is consistency over time can usually garner a little bit of support, at least from people. Being confident is part of that. So if you're consistent and persistent and you're confident in your position, strong in your position, that can help break that conformity that involves groupthink and things of that nature. And oftentimes, if one person does defect from the majority, that's often more persuasive to others than one person just disagreeing with the majority. So actions speak louder than words, and if somebody's going to refuse to conform to the majority and they defect from that group, oftentimes is the case where other people who have been keeping their mouths shut will defect as well. So that's it. Hope you found that interesting. Again, that's just kind of a quick summary, but hitting some of the major points about those 4 things.